Please.
Thinking about the drifting and how...
About?
The drifting.
The drifting. Drift, yes.
And how there's the interaction between the way that the living entity becomes oblong and the flatness of its medium. And I was thinking about intentionality in that, and what would happen if, in your metaphor of the boat, before it actually, the notion of regret sort of comes up. A lot of people, one of the things you were saying was that the boat can only go the way the boat can only go. A lot of people, particularly in therapy, say, if only I'd done so-and-so, then I could have done a bit of a different path. So how do you actually change paths when the path is already set? Do you know what I mean?
Well, first of all, the path is never already set. You see, to say the path is already set, you are implying that the consequences are already specified at the beginning.
Actually, I'd like to modify my question a bit to say, what about people who think, if only I'd done X, there would be another path?
Yeah. In general terms, the answer would be, whenever you have a structure-determined situation, and this is the usual thing, the courses of change of that system will be the result of the structural dynamics of the system. So in that sense, structural determinism is always there. A different thing is to be able to say what is going to happen in a system. So one thing has to do with the determinism in the dynamics of the system, and the other has to do with what you can say about what will happen with the system. In order to say what will happen with the system, you must make a full description of it, which allows you to make a computation of the structural changes that are going to take place in it. In fact, a prediction is a computation. It's a computation in a structure-determined system. For example, when the weather person makes an assessment of the weather situation and says it's going to rain tomorrow, and rains are going to begin at 5 o'clock in the evening, what allows him or her to make this statement is the fact that he has taken a whole series of measurements about wind, humidity, and so on and so forth in a certain area, make the whole thing a system, a structure-determined system, and then compute its structural change according to its structure in the moment in which he set up his initial observations. And it will work out the way he says or not, according to how adequate or complete is the system that he constructed with the observations that were made. If it fails, the prediction, it means that he did not have a full system in which he was making or she was making the computation. So every prediction is a computation in a structure-determined system that one has either observed or imagined. In a situation like this, we know for the nature of the phenomenon, which is an interaction of a system, a structure-determined system with another structure-determined system, that this can only have a structure-determined course, a deterministic course. But which course will have, you do not know unless you manage to treat the whole situation, the organism and the medium, as a single structure-determined system, and you make a computation in it. Usually this is not easy to do, and most of the time it's impossible to do. It's not easy to do, first of all, because you do not have a full access to the structure of this system. And you do not have a full access to the structure of the medium either. So you cannot transform this into a structure-determined system to make a computation. Particularly if you are in a boat, sitting in this boat, you do not have the same access to make this a system as an observer far away could do, like the person in the coastal guard. for the person sitting in the boat, the course that the boat follows is completely erratic. Erratic because cannot make a prediction in where it will go. For the person in the coastal guard, it's a perfectly predictable course because he has made this assessment about the winds, the waves, and so on and so forth. And still there, the precision with which he will meet the drifting boat will depend on how adequate or appropriate was his assessment. So it is not predetermined in the sense that is already here determining what will happen. There must be a history of interactions, yet the course is deterministic. And if you manage to treat the whole thing as a structured determined system, you can make a computation of what will happen. So for this fellow here, the course is predetermined. For this fellow here, it's not. And yet, for taking place, a history must take place. So it's not predetermined in the sense that here is determining what will happen. Here is that I can compute if I treat this whole thing as a structured determined system. We sometimes do not make a clear distinction between determinism and predictability. Predictability and predetermination. But if we clear these notions, then there is no problem. The system can be deterministic and unpredictable, deterministic and computable, and never predetermined, because you need a history. Now, this business of requiring a history is very important because part of the problems that we have in biology, at least, in understanding biological phenomena have to do, in relation to genetics, has to do with the fact that we do not consider history under those circumstances in which history repeats easily. If, for example, we take a seed of a plant and plant it, and perhaps we take several seeds of the same source and plant these plants, these trees, and let them grow, they grow similarly. And we say, okay, you see, it is the genetics that determines how the tree grows because it repeats. So the structure of the tree, the shape of the tree, all its characteristics are genetically determined because we do not see that history repeats. But if you change the history of interactions of the seed, then you don't get the same thing, even though you may have the same initial constitution. You need the history. And for that in biology there is a word which is called epigenesis. And this word was first presented by a British biologist, Waddington, and it means what takes place in the process of development from a particular genetic starting point. You have the same initial constitution, but different histories, you get different results. And if you know which the different histories are going to be, and you can make in each case a whole structured determined system of the system and its medium, then of course you can compute. And yet it's not predetermined because you require the history for the phenomenon to take place.
So, the determinism is the one that makes the only course possible.
Predeterminism is a...
No, not predeterminism.
Excuse me. Determinism,
so
yes.
That you can look backwards and say that was the only way it could have drifted.
Exactly. And this happens to us. You see, look, this is a very interesting thing. My whole life was lived in such a way that I'm here today. My presence here was predetermined in a way or perhaps not in a way, really predetermined, because everything happened in my life such that I am here today. This is true, and at the same time is a completely misleading reflection. Because in every historical situation, when you look backward, what you see is exactly that you are where you are because everything that took place in your history led you to that place. But did not lead to you there, but resulted in that you were there. But looking backwards seems to be like that. Rudyard Kipling has a beautiful story in this sense, which was made a film. And this is the story of two British men, soldiers, and at the same time, I do not know the English word. They were not ordinary burglars. And they decided to reach in the northern part of India to look for a place where they can become rich by using the warring character of the tribes in these areas. And they reach a place, and one of them becomes the leader and becomes so very well respected as a leader and victorious that he is considered to be the reincarnation of Alexander the Great that had been there 1,000 years, 2,000 years before. And he's treated like that. And he's given all the world, he's treated as a king. And then he reflects, my goodness, I mean, I must be the reincarnation of this man, because everything in my life has led me to this point. And the beauty of this story is that in the moment in which he believes that, everything begins to fail, because he begins to act as if what was happening to him was due to him, was not a mere result of the circumstances, and he becomes blind. Blind not in the not seeing, but blind about his circumstances, and results in his demise. But this is, I mean, in this film, Rudyard Kipling makes it very clearly, or in the story, that of course, you look backwards and everything was such that you could not but reach that point. That was your destiny. You were predestined to that. But this is the nature of historical phenomena.
There is a way in which, if you think that wherever you are in life is, of course, where you must be because of your past history, there's a way of thinking about that which almost leads to a passivity about the future.
Yeah.
In the sense that whatever happens in the future is only ever going to be a continuation of what's happened in the past. So there's a way of looking at that which takes away a sense of optimism and action orientation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not saying that you are where you must be, but I'm saying you are in the only place where you could be. It's a way, it's not a must. It's not that if I am here, I must eventually be there. No. If I am here, I'm here, and I could not be anywhere else. And if I think, oh my goodness, I should have been somewhere else, and I suffer because I'm not somewhere else, this is a nonsensical suffering. Because I could not be anywhere else. Now, to realize that frees rather than restricts, because you stop complaining about your life. You don't complain anymore. You can treat your present state as a starting point. You can say, aha, here I am. I don't like how things are with me. I want to be somewhere else. And you begin to act according to your desire. We shall see when we speak about language how your desire becomes part of the world in which you drift. Okay. Second, to realize that you follow a deterministic course, but not a predetermined course, is not the same as accepting the notion of destiny. Because it is not that you have to be somewhere else or that something must happen into your life. You do not know. But what you know is that whatever happens will be the result of how you live your life and will be the only course that is possible at any moment. Which is it, you do not know. So you know that not to do will have certain consequences, or to do will have certain consequences. You do not know which consequence will be the case, or maybe you can imagine them. But even you do not know whether you will do or not to do. You will find yourself doing nothing or doing something. Even when you say, aha, since something is going to happen anywhere, how, I should do nothing. Now, how come that you made that reflection? It turns out that it happened to you that you found yourself making that reflection. Or you say, well, but that is nonsensical. I better try to do the things that I like to do. And then it happened to you that you find yourself making this other reflection. Experience happens to you. Now, this is very interesting. Experience happens to us as coming from nowhere. We find ourselves thinking or doing whatever we think or do in the moment in which we do it. If you ask me, do you prepare your lectures? Well, there was a moment in which I prepared my lectures in the sense that I wrote them. Now, but what did I write? Did I prepare my writing? Well, yes, I read many things, but what did I read in each moment? Did I prepare my reading? And as you examine this, you find that indeed you find yourself attending to this or attending to that, and you are thinking or you are preparing of your lecture was being produced by itself in you. If I stop preparing my lectures in terms of writing them, I come here and I find myself giving a lecture which is also a surprise for me because I have not thought it before. But even if I think I'm going to say certain things particularly, the moment in which I say them, it happens to me. By this I want to say is that if you attend a little bit, you will discover that experience happens to you. And we live it as if it were coming from nowhere. What currently happens, though, is that we collapse the experience with the explanation.
The whole thing has to be in the past tense. Even the reality has to be the reality of the previous moment.
In our explanation, yes, of course. But you find yourself saying, aha, so that is so. For example, let us suppose that you are driving a car. And here you are driving, and of course you are a careful driver. Now, you are here. Well, in Chile you are here. Anyhow, you are driving your car, you are a careful driver, and you look through the rear viewing system to see whether there is another car coming or not, and you see nothing, and suddenly you are overtaken by a car. What happens to us in that moment? We may be startled. And if we are startled, we say to our neighbor, oh, that car came out of the blind spot of my rear viewing system. And notice, that car came out of the blind spot of my rear viewing system is an explanation of this appearing of this car from nowhere. The experience is suddenly a car appeared. How did it appear? Oh, because it was in the blind spot. If you belong to a different culture, you say, it was materialized from outer space. So we collapse usually the experience with the explanation. And we do not usually see that experience happens to us. Just like that, we find ourselves in it. Which does not mean that I'm saying explanations are not useful or not valid. I'm saying if we attend to that, this happens to us.
We choose some explanations from a whole range of possible explanations.
We choose some explanation.
Or that they choose us.
I do not know if we... You see, sometimes it happens to you that you present to yourself two explanations and then you make a choice. But if you do not present alternative explanation, it just happens to you that you generate a particular explanation. Now, when we speak about the nervous system and language, we shall have an explanation of how come that we generate an explanation. But in the experience, this happens to us. So if you understand that, then to know that you are deterministic and that the life course is a drift is very nice, but at the same time you do not know what is going to happen, and anyhow you will act according to your preference. If you like to be idle, you will be idle, with determinism or not, with predeterminism or not. If you enjoy doing, you will be doing with predeterminism or with determinism or not. So I don't see in this a danger, because you will act according to your emotional dynamics, not according to your reason. And we shall speak a little bit about emotions now. You will act according to your preferences. You are an active person. Doesn't matter that your life is a drift. It doesn't matter that it's deterministic. After all, you do not know what is going to happen. You act according to your preference. If you are a Muslim and you know that everything is written in the book of Allah, still you do not know what is written, so you act anyhow.
Maybe later we'll get back to right at the beginning of the history and whether or not there's anything within the living system at the beginning of its history.
Okay, we shall do that in a moment. Eh?
I find myself with an explanation that I experience. So the explanation can be part of experience.
Oh yes, of course.
Yes.
This is why when I'm explaining, I'm treating explaining as an experience to be explained.
Could I suggest a simile? That if you draw a wiggly line on the board and say that's a two-dimensional being, then all the bits that have been drawn are his past, what left him up to the point where he is. From that point on, he may see two possibilities, in which case he can make a choice. He may just act. But from the three-dimensional being, of course, he has an infinite number of choices.
Yeah, but the problem of choice is different. Let us put it in the following way. In general terms, to perform any operation, you need a procedure. You want to go to the second floor, what do? How do you get to the second floor? Well, you go upstairs, or you climb a rope, or you pick up a balloon and jump out of the balloon when it's passing in front of the second floor. You need a procedure. To make a reflection, you need a procedure. To make an election, you need a procedure. And the question is, which is the procedure for making an election or a choice? Choice entails alternatives, and entails that you are facing alternatives with complete independency for going in one way or another. Drift takes place without alternatives. In drift, there is no alternative.
That's what I meant. There are two ways. Either he can drift, or where he can see two different things, he may then choose.
True enough.
Then he's drifting. Immediately he's made the choice.
It's drifting even in the choice.
Or even in the choice.
It's drifting even in the choice.
But there is a sort of dynamic about it. Rather
That is true. But notice, the choice entails a procedure through which alternatives are presented. And that requires language. But the process is still drift.
You mentioned preference before. Am I right in saying that your preference is the result of the sum total of your previous experiences?
Yes and no. the sum business is the one that is the no, because it's more complex than that. But you are right, your preference have to do with your history. And I shall say a few things about emotions that may help us, all of us, to have some understanding of what a preference is.
Are you suggesting that in emotion there is chaotic or completely unpredictable results, so that there really is free choice? Or is the choice really...
Not chaotic. Unpredictability does not mean chaos.
There's an alternative.
Unpredictability means I, as an observer, cannot treat this system as a structurally determined system so that I can make a computation in it.
Can I put the question another way then?
Yes.
Is there really free choice? Is determinism...
Free choice in the traditional Judeo-Christian way, no. But we shall see what...
An illusion of choice is what we really have.
No, we have choice. What happens is that choice is not that which we think in the traditional Judeo-Christian tradition. You see, because in the Judeo-Christian tradition, choice is that you face alternatives which are indeed alternatives, and you are in a particular position which allows you to treat one or the other in equal terms. Now, if we are structurally determined systems, that does not happen. Although we can, through language, we can say, aha, I could go or not go, accept or not accept the invitation that my friend has made to me to come to Australia. And then I begin even to present to myself an argument. And in the process, I find myself with a preference. I prefer this argumentation for coming to this argumentation for not coming. And then I say, I make the choice of coming. So it turns out that the choice is the result of my preference. And where does my preference come from? From my structural dynamics. So the choice indeed is not taking place. In the sense that there is two possibilities which are equally valid and for which I act in complete independency. Because in the process of presenting my possibilities, this is affecting me because it is taking my own structural dynamics as well.
If we had sufficient knowledge of the organism and the medium before the choice was made, we would always be able to predict.
Exactly.
The choice. Yes.
But there are two factors which make this prediction impossible. One is that in order to know it fully, we have to destroy it. So we cannot know it fully. We have to interact it. If you want to know what are the choices of this person, you interrogate this person, you interact with it, but in the process of interacting, you interfere with it. Oh, this fellow is asking too many questions. I'm not going to answer him properly. And then this person begins to answer you things that have to do with other things than the one that you're searching for. And suddenly you end with a description which does not fit. So you make a prediction which is not valid because the person has changed in the process of being investigated to make the prediction. And that, in us, is a very fundamental thing. As soon as you try to know somebody else, and this somebody else realizes that you're trying to know him or her, changes. Now, suppose that you do this indirectly. Now, this person has other factors of internal dynamics of change, has other dimensions of interaction than those that are with you. So still you cannot. You have to enter into the domain of constraint, of control everything, to be able to know it completely in its structural dynamics so that you can make a computation of how it's going to react. So you may predict for a while, a little bit, and then suddenly your predictions fail.
So isn't there more choice in the objectivity, where the existence depends on the observer? Because the things happen within the observer, and therefore there is choice of things like attitude towards something, and sort of in that domain.
Yeah, there is choice, but not in the traditional absolute choice sense of complete free will. Yeah, because first of all, you accept a greater variability. You respect different possibilities as legitimate. You do not enter into the denial of different domains of reality on the start. In the interaction, you accept the legitimacy of the other, so your world expands.
Would I be right in saying that in our current paradigms of thought, we can't easily escape the idea that there somehow is determinism? The problem is basically whether we can know it or not. I mean, the basic constraint is you can't measure without interfering. And there are some other theories in physics which I don't understand, which allow for inability to, a fundamental inability to know. I mean, chaos theory is one. The complexity increases at a rate that is beyond any current conception of how you could possibly compute it. So whatever is happening deterministically, you couldn't possibly know it. Would that be a reasonable thing to say, that we accept it's determined, but we can't?
Yes, but there are different factors which interfere with that possibility of making a computation which constitutes a prediction. One is that, for example, if the complexity is so big that although it is deterministic, I cannot assess it to make a computation. And this would be the chaos notion.
It's even theoretically unknowable in that context, sort of thing.
Well,
Not just about
it depends on what means theoretically unknowable. If a situation is deterministic and is very complex, and there are so many factors that you cannot take into consideration all of them, then you can say, I know that I have no abilities to do this, and so my own understanding of the whole situation tells me that I cannot make a computation. Is this theoretically unknowable?
That's a distinction.
I do not know. Maybe for some people when they say it's theoretically unknowable, they mean it's intrinsically not deterministic. Now, I think that we do not deal with intrinsically indeterministic systems, not even in quantum mechanics. Because in quantum mechanics, you have the whole system of computations in terms of probabilities. Now, you cannot have probabilities in a non-deterministic situation. Because probabilities are expressions of regularities.
It's still a system.
It's still a system that has regularities that you cannot handle. So you grasp whatever regularities there are accessible to you and make a computation in probabilities. But in a fully chaotic situation, you cannot even use probabilities because there are no dimensions of regularity. But if in a chaos situation you can make computations of possible paths, then that means that it is not chaotic. It's cognitively chaotic because you cannot make a prediction. But the system doesn't go just in any possible way. It goes certain regular ways that you cannot know.
That would be really Einstein's basic idea that there are hidden variables. That there is a system there, we're seeing it probabilistically, it doesn't happen.
Yeah. The notion of hidden variables is that somehow those hidden variables are in principle accessible. What I'm saying is that if I explain experience with experience, all the elements I have are the regularities of experience to generate explanations of experience. So even the notion of hidden variables is problematic because I have no way of claiming anything about them, because as soon as I can claim something about them, they are not hidden, they belong to experience.
You don't have to postulate.
No. Now, what happens is that experience is not chaotic. Now, if experience is not chaotic, does this mean that the background from which experience arises is not chaotic? I pretend to show you that we cannot say anything because the notions that we use pertain to language, and then we cannot say with them anything in a domain which is different from the domain in which language takes place. So it resembles more the notion of Now, this is the delicate thing. I'm going to mention the notion of the void in some of the Western religious tradition, but I'm not using that as an argument for what I'm saying. I'm just mentioning there you have a line of thought which recognizes through other argumentation this problem of not being able to say anything beyond certain domain of experiences. Wittgenstein himself says about that which you cannot speak, we must remain silent. He's saying we think that there should be something there. For these reasons, we think that there should be something there. But yet, we cannot say anything about what is there, hence, we cannot say anything about what is there. But I want to show you, or I hope to show you, when I speak about language, to what extent language is the source of our existence as cognitive entities and at the same time the container of our existence as cognitive entities.
While the previous questioner was asking his question, it occurred to me that another very nice expression of the fact that you can't observe without interfering is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which you probably talked about.
Yes.
Where the thing that you want to measure is so small that any instrument that you use to measure it with, even light, will affect it. And this is the interaction.
Yeah, but that is the dispute there is whether the uncertainty principle has to do with cognition or has to do with the intrinsic features of the universe. Something like I could call like the uncertainty principle applies whenever you want to make measurements in one domain with elements of that domain. Suppose that you want to determine the position of cars in the traffic system of a city with car collisions. You want to determine the position and velocity of a car by touching the car with another car. Then you cannot do it. You will have there the same thing as the uncertainty principle with elementary particles. So whenever you want, suppose that you want to determine the personality characteristic of a person with personal interactions. You don't get it, because the personal interaction results in a change in the characteristic of the person with whom you interact in order to determine his characteristics. This is why we end restricting the other. You see, we want to know our friends. We interact with our friends. And then we decide that our friends have certain characteristics that we claim we see in our interactions, and we immediately restrict our friend. We do not see and we do not allow its variability. Because it's the only possibility for claiming that we know something about the other is restrict his variability or her variability, because the very interaction for knowing results in a change, exactly in the same terms as the Heisenberg principle. Yet, if I want to know the position of a car by sending light with particles that interfere very little with the path of the car, no problem. But if my particles are other cars, then there is a tremendous problem. I cannot determine the position or the velocity and velocity of the car simultaneously. It's exactly the same.
What's the problem of knowing something as it changes?
Okay, the problem has to do with knowing. Let me tell you something about knowing. This diagram refers to these two explanatory paths which differ in whether I have accepted or not the question about the observer. If I do not accept the question about the observer, I treat the abilities of the observer as endowments, as given properties, and which is the fundamental ability of the observer? Which is it? it is to be able to make reference to something independent from him or her. So what is to know? When you ask, what is to know in this explanatory path? To know is precisely that, to make reference to something independent from you. I know that this is the case because, and you make the pointing, or make a reference. Reason tells me that, and you speak as if dealing with something that is independent from you, about which you can speak. You must know that. You are recommending to some person to observe something that's independent from him or from her. So knowledge in this explanatory path of objectivity without parentheses is a reference to something that it is taken to exist with independency from the observer. If you ask what is, the answer is a reference to something that exists independent from you. In this other explanatory path, you have accepted the question about the observer. And by accepting the question about the observer, you have realized that the abilities of the observer are the result of something else. Because this is what you do when you accept an explanatory question. You commit yourself to propose a mechanism or a procedure or a process which will result in that which you want to explain. So by accepting as a legitimate question the question, how come that I can do whatever I can do as an observer, you are accepting as legitimate to propose a mechanism, a process, such that as a result of it, observing will arise. And then you become aware that what validates your cognitive statements is what you do. So the question, what is to know, has an entirely different character. And you have to look at it looking at what you do. Now, suppose that you are a teacher. How do you know whether your students know? I mean, this is an interesting activity, isn't it? Either you are a teacher at school, or a teacher in the university, or a teacher in a community, and you want to know whether your students know. What do you do? And we all do something, and we all say, he or she knows, or he or she does not know, and sometimes we say, I know, or I do not know. What are we doing? We are doing something very simple. We are assessing the behavior of the other. And if we find that the behavior of the other is adequate in a certain domain that we specify with our question, according to a particular criterion that we put for what is adequate behavior, we say he or she knows. We ask a question to our student. The student performs. We consider that the performance is adequate according to a criterion that we have. We say yes. The student knows. And if we have a committee examining a particular student, this professor says, does not know. This other professor says, something, he knows something. And this other professor says, this knows fantastic. I mean, this is a fantastic knowledgeable student. Which is the difference? This fellow thinks that the behavior of the student is completely inadequate according to his or her listening in the domain in which he or she poses the question. This other thing that, some aspects of the behavior are adequate, some others are not, and this other fellow thinks that all the behavior is adequate according to his or her listening. So, the knowledge of this person is a gift from the listener. My knowledge is given to me by you in the moment in which you accept what I do as adequate action in the domain in which you are listening to me. So thank you very much. Isn't that interesting? We give knowledge to the other. And this is what we do, by the way. Look, and this is not a speculation about fantasies. This is what we do all the time. And if you say, I know nothing about that, suppose that you are invited to do certain things. I mean, you, please, why don't you lead us in this excursion on the mountains? You say, no, I know nothing about mountain climbing. What are you saying? You are saying, according to my criterion of what mountain climbing is, my behavior in mountain climbing is not adequate. But the other said, oh, you know, you have been in this mountain so many times. What they are saying is, according to our criterion of what is mountain climbing in this part, your behavior in mountain climbing is adequate. Isn't that interesting? So, it is not that we do not know what is knowledge when we follow this explanatory path of objectivity in parentheses. We know much better because we are aware of what we do when we claim knowledge. And if I say we know much better, this applies what I have said to what I'm saying too. That means that according to the criterion that I have, my explanation of knowing is an adequate behavior in that domain which I have asked the question. But notice, here, the is not a reference to something independent of the observer. It's validated through a reference to what the observer does. Now, which was your question?
What is the difficulty in knowing something when it changes? If my interaction with you changes you, then how does that become a difficulty in my knowing it?
Will depend on your criterion for accepting what is adequate knowledge, what is adequate action in your expectations with respect to me. If you find out that I do what you expect me to do, you say that you know me. And for a while this may work.
Whether you're changing or not.
Yeah, because you do not know what is happening to me. The only thing that you see is my behavior. Now, psychologists they know something very well. They know that if they have a system, a biological system, and apply a stimulus, they obtain a certain response. They repeat the stimulus, they may obtain the same response. But if you repeat and repeat, suddenly the organism doesn't respond the same way anymore. Perhaps never again, and they say learning has taken place, or perhaps for a while, and then they say accommodation has taken place. But what happens is that it's changing the system in this process. Now, with personal relations, what is involved in addition is the desire for regularity in them. It's the desire for control of them. Oh, I want my children to behave in such a way that I always know where they are when I am not with them. So you want, or I want, whoever the person is, certain regularity in the behavior of the children. So what do? Restrict their variability. How? By giving instructions, by punishment, by whatever it is, you reduce the variability so that you can predict their behavior. Or you do something which is much more clever than that. You have a conversation with your children in a space of responsibility, so that you don't have to know where they are, because you have confidence that wherever they are, they will be doing adequate behavior. But it's entirely different thing. In the first case, you want to know. In the second case, you let be. When we want to know the other, we restrict the other. Unavoidably, because the other is flowing. You, I, all of us. You are not the same as yesterday, I'm not the same as yesterday. I have thought to say certain things, here I find myself saying other things that I have thought to say, and so on and so forth. You listen to me. If I say today the same things I said yesterday, you listen differently. In 19 1968, there was in Chile, as there was in many parts of the world, the student revolution in May, April. Students took over universities and so on and so forth. And I managed to become an honorary student. I asked them to let me to participate in the meetings, even though I was an assistant, I was not a professor, promising that I would not do any work in the university, but just participate with them. And it was very interesting because I had the opportunity to listen precisely to this. In a big meeting, something said at the beginning and the same thing said at the end were entirely different things. What has changed? The listening of the people. And changes anyhow. You think that you are not changing, you are changing. But something is not changing. And this I wish to talk about. Notice that in the drift, I'm repeating the drawing. There are two things that are not changing: the organization and the adaptation to the medium, the congruence with the medium. This is an autopoietic system. It's an autopoietic system, has been autopoietic all the time, is in a domain of interactions which are only perturbations, and has been in interactions that are only perturbations until it dies. So what has not changed are certain relations that have to do with the conditions of existence. But everything else has been changing. I claim that all of us have existed for the so many years that we have existed under conditions in which our organization as living system has not changed and our relation of congruence with the medium has not changed. And yet our structure has changed tremendously. Our behavior has changed tremendously. Our reflections have changed tremendously. So change is always in relation to something that is conserved. When one speaks about chaos, one cannot even speak about change because there is no reference. This is why one speaks about chaos. There is nothing which remains invariant with respect to which one can say something has changed. Now, this that happens with the living system is valid to every system. And it's a dynamic condition which is valid to any situation in which a system is constituted. For example, suppose that you want to become an engineer. You enter into the engineering school. What changes and what remains invariant? Well, your relation with the engineering school as a student must remain invariant. Because if it is broken, then you are out. So you have to go 7 years in the engineering school. The relation being a student must remain invariant. And you do everything around conserving the relation being a student. And in the process, you change your structure, you change your behavior, you go through examinations, everything, conserving the relation student. What happens with the relation student is not conserved anymore. Either you graduate, which is a nice ending, or you flunk, which is a not so nice ending. But to learn engineering, you must conserve the condition, that means the relation of studentship for a certain number of years, and undergo transformations during that period. If you marry and constitute a family, what is conserved? There will be children, you will become older, there will be moments of joy, moments of distress, sometimes some anger will go away, and so on and so forth. But what is conserved? The passion for living together that constitutes familyship. The passion for living together ends, no family anymore. Yet, many things have changed in the process of the many years in which this passion has been conserved. So, this is very fundamental, because whatever becomes conserved, whatever it is conserved, is the reference for change. Change is not something that takes place just in itself. It takes place only in reference to something that is conserved. Here in the drift, I said ontogeny structural drift. That means that the structure is changing while the relation, the organization of the system and the relation of adaptation to the medium are conserved. But the medium is also changing, with a certain dynamic that has to do with its own. Suppose that you enter a political party. You have entered a domain of conservation of certain relations. Suppose that you say, I am a person of principles. My principles are such and such and such. You have stipulated a condition of conservation of certain relations that you consider to be your principles. I got in great trouble in Chile in 1969 because I said, I am a man without principles. I have certain purposes, but no principles. So it is not trivial. Huh? A firm, an enterprise, becomes defined by what is conserved. And as that is conserved, all the rest can change because the identity is defined in the conservation. If this is an autopoietic system, the identity of the system is defined in the conservation of autopoiesis. If this is a school, the identity of this is defined in the conservation of the relations that constitute it as a school. If this is a factory that produces whatever it produces, and that production defines its identity, everything can change around the conservation of that. Let us suppose that this is a factory that produces certain detergents, produces detergent, and income, money. And this is what you have to conserve, production of detergent and money. the rest of the world will change around that. And all that will be conserved is increase of income and production of detergent. You contaminate, it doesn't matter, provided you produce detergent and money. People get poor and people get rich, it doesn't matter, provided you produce detergent and money. The only way that you will not contaminate is that not to contaminate is part of the definition of the entity and hence part of what is being conserved. And this is a systemic dynamic. Now, what are different kinds of living systems? Different kinds of living systems are different kinds of manners of living that are conserved. We are human beings through the conservation of a particular manner of living that entails languaging. And in this process, everything else can change. How we live, how we dress, what things we do, how many we are, all that can change, provide certain relations that define a manner of living in languaging are conserved. We remain human. And that takes place as a systemic phenomenon. Almost without effort. In living, it takes place without effort. I mean, none of us is making any effort for living. So what happens then is that in this history of ontogenic structural drift, in which what is conserved is the organization of the living system in congruence with the medium, and the circumstances in which the medium changed also congruently with the system, certain consequences take place. And one of them I mentioned yesterday, which is this congruent change, and I make this following drawing, which I shall repeat. System A and system B, C, A, B, C. And this is valid for any system. For example, for the shoe and the foot and the feet, the shoes and the feet. Have you noticed how wonderful is this relation? Because the feet and the shoes change together. And the beauty of it that they change together comfortably. As the shoes get old, the feet change and it's comfortable, and it's so comfortable that when you go to buy new shoes, you have a great difficulty in finding comfortable shoes. Have you ever done the following experiment of buying 2 pairs of shoes which fit wonderfully? Saying, oh, I have lots of money, I shall buy 2 pairs which are identical, fit wonderfully, and I shall keep 1 pair for a year until the others are worn out, and then I shall use these. And then you keep in the closet, you look at these beautiful shoes periodically to be sure that they are there and beautiful, they are wonderful shoes, but you don't use them because within a year you are going to use them when the others are not good anymore. 1 year passes, 1 year and a half, and then you come to use these and they don't fit. course they don't fit, because your feet and your shoes have changed together. So you don't have the same feet that you had before. So those shoes do not fit. But the whole process of change of the feet and the shoes have taken place just as a matter of course in this history of recurrent interaction. But recurrent interactions must take place. If you don't use them, it doesn't happen. Now, I would like to say a few things about what happens in these dynamics of interactions between two living systems that are in recurrent interactions. What happens there? Of course, in order to say what happens, you must be an observer. So you will be observing and make commentaries. Notice that this situation is exactly like this. Here we have A, and this in a way is B plus C. So, for A to be in this situation or to be in this other one is the same thing. A does not distinguish features of the medium yet, because it has no procedure, no mechanism to make distinction. It's a structure-determined entity that is undergoing its structural dynamics. Because in order to make an observation about the medium, you must have a procedure, certain operationality that will allow to say that is different from me, and from the perspective of that difference I can say something about that. This fellow can say so. The observer can say these things. The observer can say, aha, look, this situation for A is the same as here. What happens is that A doesn't see that the medium entails B and C. But the same is valid for B. So this story is also a structural drift. But the observer can make certain commentaries, can make certain reflections. For example, he can say, aha, I see certain regularities. I see that when A impinges on B, B reacts in a particular way, which I can describe as a coordination of behavior. Because behavior the observer makes the distinction of two phenomenal domains here. Let us, for the moment, the observer can see the internal structural dynamics and can see the interactions of this entity as a totality in a medium. We call usually this internal structural dynamics, when we speak about living systems, as physiology. The internal structural dynamics, the operation of the machine, if it is a machine. In this case, it's a living system. And this we call behavior. For behavior to take place, this entity must operate as a totality. For physiology to take place, this entity must be a composite entity. I shall repeat. I say that when we look at the living system and we look to its internal dynamics, we have a word for this in biology at least, which is physiology. If I am a mechanic looking at the engine, I will speak about the operation of the engine. I would not use the word physiology, but I could have used the word the physiology of the car. It refers only to the internal dynamics. And when I look at this entity as a totality in interactions in a medium, I speak about behavior. How is your car behaving, sir or madam? And this is a question that the mechanic can say. And you say, look, I mean, it vibrates in this funny way when I am at such and such a speed. Oh, okay, I know what is happening in the physiology of the car. This is what the mechanic would say, or the physician. What is your complaint? Look, it happens that I can't walk. Oh, I know what is happening in your hip, because this is a case I have examined many times. You have an arthrosis of this kind. I'm sure when you were a child, you lived in this and this condition. But the behavior to take place, this entity must be or must act as a totality. When the observer looks at this totality in relation to the medium, speaks of behavior. When looks at the internal dynamics, speaks about physiology, and these two phenomenal domains do not intersect. Do not intersect. That means the phenomena of physiology are not phenomena of behavior, and the phenomena of behavior are not phenomena of physiology. One of the complaints that psychologists frequently have with respect to physiologists is that they hear the physiologists saying that they can explain behavior in physiological terms. And the psychologists say, no, you cannot. Or people thinking about human experiences, mind, consciousness, they say, no, I mean, you cannot explain mind in terms of physiology. Are you going to reduce the mind to nerve cells, to nerve impulses? No, I can't believe it. So there is a basic understanding that these two are not intersecting phenomenal domains, are phenomena of different kinds. But this general understanding, which sometimes is dismissed by the physiologist, is valid. What happens is that if I am a good mechanic, and the person that brings the car tells me, my car does this and that and such circumstances, I know, because I have seen many cars, that this correlates with this particular manner of operation of the engine. And for me as a mechanic, it is obvious that relation. And I listen to it as if, by speaking of this, I could speak of that. And I treat these two phenomena as having some causal relation between each other. Yet, they are not. The relation between one and the other is realized by the observer. It's the observer who realizes the relation between physiology and behavior. But physiology and behavior take place in different phenomenal domains. You need a special relation which is provided by the observer to correlate them. This does not mean that they are fully independent, no, but there is no causal relation. Without physiology, you do not have behavior, yes, but the behavior pertains to the relation of the organism in the medium, not to the physiology. Even though if you change the physiology, the behavior changes.
In the case of a psychiatrist, we'll make a point that one psychiatrist is on the left, objectivity as reality. Can he operate effectively, or must a successful psychiatrist be one with objectivity in parenthesis and in God and
In some cases, he could operate effectively. Suppose that the psychiatrist and the client belong to the same culture. They have the same fundamental beliefs. Then, of course, they can interact and they can have a conversation, and changes will take place through this conversation, which will never create a contradiction because they have the same fundamental beliefs. Now, suppose that client and psychiatrist do not have the same fundamental beliefs. Then the psychiatrist will find that the client is intrinsically wrong in certain things. It's not circumstantially wrong, it's intrinsically wrong. And a special conflict will arise, which may or not be solved according to how they handle the situation. It may happen, though, that as the relation between doctor and patient is established, they jump here without thinking about it. And this is where emotions will appear. So this may happen. But if they remain here, then there is no possibility because they will negate each other.
Would you prefer to be under a psychiatrist that was in the second case?
I would prefer, because in that way, and not only the psychiatrist, you're asking about preference, and this is not a recommendation, not a demand. I would prefer, yes, because this allows more flexibility to the whole relation, respect. You see, because since this is a situation of awareness, disagreement does not entail denial. Disagreements are legitimate. We shall speak a little bit more about that. I said yesterday, when we want the other to do what we want, usually we relate with the other in objectivity without parentheses. But with friends, we relate in objectivity in parentheses. And when with friends we begin to demand, friendship comes to an end. So in daily life we move. Now if we are aware, then of course it's much better for the dynamics of the relation. But I shall come to that in a while when we want to say a few things about emotions. But this is an interesting point. There are two non-intersecting phenomenal domains, and to accept non-intersecting phenomenal domains and recognize them is very important, because if we do not recognize them, we confuse them, we flatten them, either in our beliefs or in our demands. For example, I as a physiologist may believe that I can explain behavior through physiology. I say, look, if I give you certain drugs, you will behave in a certain way. This drug explains your behavior, or the action of this drug explains your behavior. That is a flattening. It's a confusion. It's not true. If I take certain drug, my structure changes, and as my structure changes, my behavior changes. But my behavior is taking place here. It's not taking place in my nervous system. Although without my nervous system, I do not have behavior. Now, this is fundamental to realize that there are phenomena that entail our nervous system but do not take place in it. Behavior in particular. Behavior requires the internal dynamics of the organism, requires the nervous system in us, yet does not take place in the nervous system, takes place in the relation. And you cannot reduce one of these phenomenal domains to the other because they do not intersect.
Are these kind of conceptual domains? When you say phenomenal domains, are they kind of relative
No,
to reality?
they are experiential domains.
Experiential domains.
For example, here I walk. Where does walking take place? Walking takes place in my relations as a totality with this particular medium. Now, do I require my nervous system? Yes. Without the operation of my nervous system, I could not walk? No. But what constitutes walking is my displacement in this room, not the internal dynamics of my nervous system.
The internal dynamics can also be explained by the difference between physiology and behavior at different levels. So you can take a cell
Yes.
and have physiology of a cell and its behavior.
Yes. Yes. This is why this is a general statement whenever you take a unity and a circumstance. And this is a very important point, because this is valid to any system. In this case, I'm speaking about the organism, but you are right. This is valid to any system and its circumstance. Yes?
If I find myself yawning as somebody in the experience, I don't know, is this physiology or is it behavior? Is it related to what's happening in the room of my
Well, yawning, suppose that you begin to yawn, yes. And I say, my goodness, this fellow is bored to death. That is behavior. That yawning pertains to the domain of relation.
But isn't it part of autopoiesis?
Of course it is.
Surviving?
Yes.
Part of my physiology?
Yes. But what is part of your physiology is the dynamics that results in the opening of the mouth and so on and so forth. But suppose that you are joining in the desert. I say nothing. But if you are joining here, I say, my goodness, this fellow is very tired, or what I'm saying is very boring. And I change what I'm saying. So that pertains to the dynamic of our interactions. And you become aware too, you say, my goodness, I join here, his fellow is going to think that I'm bored. I'm not bored, I'm just tired. That pertains to the relation. Yet at the same time, for that behavior, for that structural changes in your bodyhood open to my observation to take place, you require the physiology. But that is joining as a behavior in a relation under certain circumstances, and other circumstances is not. This is why behavior pertains to the relations, pertains to here. Suppose that I do the following. I'm mimicking walking. I don't do it very well, I'm not a good mime, but I'm mimicking walking. I'm doing certain behavior, that certain dynamics of my structure, which is walking under certain circumstances and is mimicking walking under other circumstances. There's entirely different things in the relation, and yet in the internal dynamics could be the same. Now, what happens in us, of course, is that what we do in the behavior has certain consequences on us. If you are aware that you are joining here, then they say, my goodness, I must be more careful of whatever it is. I must make a sign that I'm interested, because it's not that I'm bored, or I'm glad that I joined so that this fellow changes a little bit what he's talking. But that is another phenomenon which has to do with the consequences of what is happening here in the physiology. But behavior and physiology are different kinds of phenomena, and one does not pertain to the other. By the way, this is not a unique situation.
Hasn't the question been posed as if the person was the observer of themselves, and that they are trying to explain their experience, rather than you're the observer to a yawn. You can be your experience, the observer to your own experience of a yawn, and then you collapse the experience of the explanation, and then get caught into a circle where you don't know whether it's physiology or behaviour.
Well, you are right when you bring forth this fact that one can be observer of oneself. But that requires certain operationality, of which we shall talk. But
I thought that was a mistake in the question, the way the question was posed.
Oh, I see. Well, but yeah, he was indeed saying, he was putting the question in those terms. What happens to me and what happens in the relation, indeed. Yeah, you are right. But of course I can observe myself. But for that it requires certain operationality. And what we shall find out is that still that distinction is valid, even when I am observing myself.
It is a question of level of interpretation.
Level of interpretation.
That the phenomenon is the same, but you can interpret it in different ways depending on...
I would say no. I would say no. The phenomena are different. In the strict sense, the structural dynamics, I can say the structural dynamics that leads to the body dynamics that an observer says is joining, or which I can say is joining, the structural dynamics is the same. Yes. But what happens in the domain of behavior is one thing or another depending on the circumstances of the interaction. But it's not the same thing seen in different ways. Turn out to be different things precisely because the course followed is different. Because if I perform this in the desert, this is a joining which expresses my tiredness. There are,
It's meaning.
Exactly. But its meaning pertains to the relation. But that is what it is.
So the meaning is the thing that is the domain.
The meaning is?
The meaning and domain are the things that are related.
Yeah. Let us come to that later when we speak a little bit about the mind. But what I want to say is that unless we specify something, for example, I can specify the structural dynamics of the body, unless I do that, I cannot say that there is a phenomenon interpreted in two different manners. If I specify the structural dynamics of the body, I can say, yes, under these circumstances, this structural dynamics is joining, expressing, boring. Under these other circumstances, is joining, expressing tiredness. But I have to specify that. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, I think it was with you, about whether something could be the same seen from different perspectives. I say that only one has specified that something to be seen differently. But if not, you have different things. But we shall come back to that a little bit more later. Shall we have a break? Yeah. A question and then we...
I was just going to say, there really aren't any standard observers, are there? Every observer will interact. And every observer because there are different interactions.
But the standard observer may arise when through living together a common criterion for distinction arises. And we shall speak about that. Yeah.
You're going to have a nice surprise.
What do you mean? Now, I was talking about these non-intersecting phenomenal domains. Now, let me give you an example of another kind which has to do with the same thing. Let us suppose that we have here books. The class of books. And here we have pages. The class of pages. Well, no doubt that books have pages, but pages do not belong to the class of books. Pages are not elements of the class of books. And books are not elements of the class of pages, because a book is two or more pages bind together by one edge. If that is what a book is, two or more pages bind together by an edge, a single page is not a book. So the class of pages does not belong to the class of books. They do not intersect, I mean. Yet they are related by a particular relation which is binding. If you bind pages together, then you get books. So we say, you get books by binding pages that statement refers to an operation that does not belong to the books, nor to the pages, but which is a legitimate relation for the constitution of books. So there you have two domains that do not intersect, but can be related through some other operation that does not belong to any of them. Without pages, you do not have books, but books and pages belong to different classes of entities. The same thing happens here. Physiology and behavior are different kind of phenomena. Without physiology, you do not get behavior. But behavior does not belong to the domain of physiology. Physiology does not belong to the domain of behavior. And the relation between behavior and physiology is established through an observer that correlates them. There is no causal relation. You cannot say that pages cause books. Yet, if you bind them together, you get books. If you have a particular physiological dynamic with the organism and the particular circumstances, such that in these physiological dynamics, this operates as a totality in a particular way in those circumstances, then you have a behavior. Yet behavior does not belong to physiology and vice versa. Now, this is a very useful notion to understand explaining. Because, I said, an explanation is the proposition of a process that gives rise to the experience to be explained as a result of its operation accepted by a listener. So, the experience explained is the result of the operation in some particular manner of other elements of experience, such that if these other elements of experience operate in that particular way, the result is the experience that is being explained. So by an explanation, you never reduce one phenomenal or experiential domain to another. An explanation does not consist in expressing the same experience in more fundamental terms, consists in proposing a generative relation. And scientific explanations particularly. Let me tell you a little bit about scientific explanations. And I shall mention scientific explanations only for having an idea. This is only the understanding of what a scientific explanation does that I want to convey. Scientific explanation is one kind of explanations. I said that there are many kinds of explanations, as there are many kinds of criteria for accepting reformulations of experience. Because an explanation is a process proposed that would generate as a result of its operation the experience to be explained, accepted as such by a listener according to some criterion that he or she has. For example, in the case of scientific explanation, I speak of the criterion of validation of scientific explanations. I say we scientists like to explain and like to explain using a particular criterion for accepting our explanations, for accepting the mechanisms that we propose to generate the phenomena or the experience that we want to explain. And this criterion is very simple and pertains to daily life. It's nothing special. Criterion of validation of scientific is with F or PH? With F, isn't it? Yeah. Explanations. Now, an explanation is the proposition of a process or a mechanism that would give rise to that which you want to explain. So, criterion of validation of scientific explanation. What you need is the satisfaction of 4 relations conjointly. The first one, or one, is the description of the experience that one wants to explain. You say, I want to explain the blueness of the sky. What do you mean? Yeah, you see, whenever you come out and you look at the sky, it's blue. And if you look in the direction of the sun, it's not so blue, it's more yellowish, but 90 degrees with respect to the sun is very blue. I want to explain that. How come that? Or I want to explain neurosis. What do you mean by neurosis? Well, there are certain persons that have this particular behavior under certain circumstances. This was the question of Freud, and I want to explain this. So you describe what an observer must do to have the experience that you want to explain. 2, and here comes a very important point. I mean, all points are important, but this is crucial because this is what eventually will be the explanation. The proposition of a generative mechanism. Proposition of a generative mechanism. Of the experience to be explained. If I say generative, we are more likely to hear that I'm referring to a process and its result. If I say causal, we are more prone to hear that the antecedent determines what follows. I'm speaking precisely about a process and its result. Every one of us has experiences of the difference between the process and the result. No one of us confuses the embryological development of a baby with the baby. The baby is the result of a process of embryological development. Now, one would not easily say that the embryological development caused the baby. Of course, you need the embryological development to have the baby, but it's not a causal relation. There is a recognition that there is 2 things which are different, which is of the same kind as this. The baby is the result of a process, does not belong to the phenomena of the process. The phenomena of the process do not belong to the phenomena under which the baby is a totality. Yet without the embryological development, you do not have the baby. And this is what you have to propose. A generative mechanism. A process which, if you let it operate in your domain of experiences, you experience, as a consequence, that experience that you want to explain. God every morning gets out very early with a pail of paint and a big brush and paints the sky. That would be a generative mechanism. Or the light from the sun, the different wavelengths, cross the atmosphere and are dispersed differentially by the different size of the particles. The long wavelengths go through the atmosphere because the particles of the atmosphere are very small and they do not scatter the long wavelengths, so they scatter only the short wavelengths. So this is why at 90 degrees of the source of light, which is the sun, you see the most blue because you have the greatest scattering in your direction of short wavelengths. If you look in the direction of the sun, you will have that the short wavelengths will be scattered, they don't reach you, only the long wavelengths will reach you and looks more reddish or yellowish. That would be, if that happens, then you will get exactly what I have just described. That would be the generative mechanism. If indeed there are different lights of different wavelengths, and if indeed there is scattering, and if indeed there is this atmosphere with this kind of particles, then what will happen is exactly that which I have described. Or if indeed there is God, and indeed he gets up early in the morning and has paint and goes with the brush painting the sky in this way, then when you get up you will see the sky. Both are generative mechanisms that you propose. But to accept them as scientific explanations, you have to satisfy other conditions. The third condition that must be satisfied is the deduction. And deduction is a computation. The deduction from all the operational, and if I speak about operational, I mean experiential. Whatever is operational has to do with the regularities of your experience. Operational coherences or regularities entailed into, if I say God in the morning gets up very early with a pail of paint and a big brush and paints this, I imply a whole domain of coherences, of operational coherences, in which what I have just said is valid. If I speak of God, I speak of a particular kind of entity, which particular abilities or particular preferences or whatever it is, there is a whole domain of coherences. So much so that I say God has a headache, somebody can tell me, what do you mean? I mean, God with a headache, I don't believe it. Does that not pertain to the operational coherences of Godness to have headaches? He just says, away with the headache, and he is free of the headache. For example. Or if I say, light comes and is dispersed by these small particles of the atmosphere, I entail a whole domain of operational coherences that has to do with electromagnetic waves, different wavelengths, with scattering phenomena, and so on and so forth. So deduction from all the operational coherences entailed in two of other experiences that the observer may have and of what to do. To have them. Deduction from all the operational coherences entailed in two of other experiences that the observer may have and of what to do to have them. If God gets up very early with a pail of paint and a brush to paint the sky, well, maybe if I steal the brush, he will not be able to paint the sky blue, for example. Or if I change the paint in the pail, the sky will appear green. Or, in the case of the dispersion, if there is much dust in the atmosphere, so these particles are bigger, I will not only have a scattering of the short wavelengths, I will have a scattering of the long wavelengths, so the sky will look less blue, because I shall have also a scattering of long wavelengths. So I can produce lots of smoke and then look in this area and will not look bluish, will begin to look yellowish or reddish. Or I could do something similar in my laboratory. If that is the case, I can make a suspension of little particles, illuminate, and see a differential scattering depending from the side from which I look, which is what I mentioned when I said if you take milk in a little test tube and put a light and look from the side, you see it blue, and look in front of it, you see it yellowish or reddish. And 4, the realization of what, or the experience better, of what has been deduced in 3. The experience of what has been deduced in 3. That means doing what has been deduced in 3 and experiencing it. If all this is satisfied conjointly, then point 2 becomes a scientific explanation. If you have described the conditions under which you can have certain experience and you realize this experience, if you have proposed a generative mechanism with elements of your experience such that if those elements operate, you have the experience that you propose, that you want to explain. And if you have deduced other experiences which you have realized by doing whatever the deduction tells that you should do, then proposition 2 becomes a scientific explanation. So scientific explanations are generative mechanisms accepted as valid because they are part of the satisfaction of these 4 operations. This is what we scientists do. This is not necessarily what philosophers of science say that we scientists do. And philosophers of science do not know what scientists do because they do not do science. So they think or speak about other notions. But this is what the scientists do. Whether he or she has reflected or not about what he does or she does, this is what is done. And the whole training of a scientist has to do with the satisfaction of these conditions in the explaining. Notice, the scientific explanation is a generative mechanism. Notice, the phenomena or the experiences involved in the generative mechanism are different from those involved in the experience to be explained, because this experience to be explained is a result of the operation of the generative mechanism. Again, we have a relation comparable to this. generative mechanism and experience to be explained pertain to non-intersecting phenomenal domains, non-intersecting experiential domains. This is why scientific explanations do not consist in phenomenic reductions. When people criticize science by claiming it's reductionist, they do not understand what science does. Science is not reductionist. It's a misunderstanding of what scientific explanations do. Scientific explanations validate at least two domains of experience. That in which the experience to be explained takes place, and that in which the generative mechanism takes place. Now, the understanding of this is liberating because allows to realize that indeed you can use science to explain anything if you can satisfy these conditions. It doesn't matter what experience you want to explain. If you can satisfy these conditions, you can explain it scientifically. Mystical experience. You want me to explain mystical experience? No problem, if I can satisfy these conditions. If I cannot satisfy these conditions, then I do not get the explanation. But I do not get the explanation because I cannot satisfy these conditions, not because mystical experiences cannot be explained a priori. But notice that if I want to explain mystical experience, what I have to provide is a generative mechanism, a process that should take place as a result of which the mystical experience takes place. So the fact that the mystical experience takes place in one experiential domain and the generative mechanism takes place in another is not the problem, because you are not reducing the mystical experience to this other experiential domain. You are not reducing a mystical experience to a physiological phenomena if you manage to provide a physiological mechanism which will result in the mystical experience. Now that is, to understand that is liberating. We stop having this criticism which is not a legitimate criticism about science. Oh, science is reduction. It's Cartesian science is reduction. No, this is a misunderstanding. At the same time, that does not free us from the responsibility of satisfying these conditions if we want to make a scientific explanation. On the contrary. The other thing that is worthwhile realizing is that point 1 and 2, I say point 1 and 2 are the poetry of doing science. Are scientists poets? Yes. When they are dealing with point 1 and 2. What do I mean by this? What does a poet do? Well, if you ask me, I shall tell you. I'm proposing that you ask me. Yes?
Render experience in words.
Please?
Render experience in words.
Render experience in words. But not only render experience in words, but render a configuration of experience in words. And not only rendering a configuration of experience, grasping a configuration and conserving this configuration in a story, which is what you are saying in words. But it's a configuration. It's not a particular experience. And this is what is peculiar in the look of the poet, and this is what makes poets so dangerous. Every totalitarian regime persecutes poets. Why? Because they grasp configurations of experiences, configurations of relations. And they present this in some story in which the particularities of the elements of the story are, of course, artificial, fantastic, whichever. But it's the configuration of the experience that is being rescued in the story that is the important thing of the poetic act. And from where does the poet capture this configuration of experience? From his or her life. From where does the scientist bring forth a question? From his or her life. And what question? Usually the interesting thing, and this is what the poetic part is that the question is never a question for a particular event. It's a question for a configuration of events.
So is that to say then that there is a collapse of experience and explanation?
No. No. You grasp a certain configuration and you say, aha, this kind of thing I want to explain. Look, I have this question. How come that we know? And then I have to present this question in such a way that what I grasp is a configuration of experiences that constitute this phenomenon of knowing. If I cannot do that, then I cannot work because I don't have a question that I can handle. And the good scientists are good poets. They grasp these configurations and present it properly so that it can be subject to the next point, which is the proposition of a generative mechanism. And where does the scientist...
Sorry, I'm stuck. How is this not an explanation?
The explanation is the generative mechanism. And this is only the experience that you want to explain. Point one is the experience that you want to explain. It's not the generative mechanism. You want to explain the blueness of the sky.
We're not collapsing one into two.
No, because what you want to... You see, whenever you look out, you see blue. Do you? Come here and look. See? Blue. That is what...
This is the exercise, I'll take your word for it.
Huh? Okay. That is the experience to be explained. That is not a generative mechanism. I'm collapsing nothing. Could be that for somebody else, I'm collapsing, but what I'm explaining is that which appears as the experience in the collapse. It doesn't matter what experience you want to explain. We may want to explain explaining. You may want to explain something that results from this collapsing, whatever it is. But in that moment, is what you want to explain. If you do this and this and this is what you experience. This I want to explain. And you get that from your experience, from your life.
In the practice of science, they're interrelated, one and two.
Yes, they're interrelated because this also comes from your life experience, point two.
And because the description can involve some explanation.
The description can involve some explanation that you take for granted already. You use that as raw material, so to speak, for the description of the experience. But then becomes part of it, not part of the explanation. It's part of it, is the elements of it.
Can you just clarify on the difference between an experience and a configuration of experience that gives rise to the question, this word configuration?
For example, it could be, today I came out and saw the sky blue. I want to explain how come that today I came out and saw the sky blue. This is a different situation than say, whenever I come out, I see the sky blue, and I don't just see the sky blue, I see the sky blue in certain directions with respect to the sun. So I see the sun, I see the sky blue, I'm positioning myself in this. It's a whole constellation of things that I take somehow as a totality, as a configuration of things that happen to me.
It's a repeated experience.
Repeated experience or repeated relations of experiences. If I never go out, that question will never arise. So in the training of a scientist, you need the young person to expand his or her domain of experiences in some domain so that he or she can have questions. The same as the writer that needs to live a little bit more than just the confine of his desk or her desk there to write something. If very young, will write a novel that has to do with his youth life. If there's an old person, will write a novel that has to do with his or her long life. Has lived in this area or in this area, has done this kind of thing or that kind of thing. It's from there where the novel will spring. The same here. If I want to do questions in biology, I have to live with living beings. The more and the longer and the more involved I am in my living with living beings, the wider my domain of experiences from which I'm going to have questions about living beings. So this is why part of the training of a scientist is immerse him or her in that domain. Now, the mistake is committed when one thinks that he has to know facts. Well, of course, but he has to know facts as experiences from which he or she will bring his questions. It's not as facts that he needs or she needs them. Yet, in some moment, he will use or she will use these as elements for proposing a generative mechanism. The generative mechanism also comes from the experience, from the life of the person that is acting as a scientist. Einstein used to say that scientific theories were free creations of the human mind. It's in this sense that they are free creations of the human mind. It is not the case that the phenomena are out there to be discovered, although scientists do speak in those terms. The phenomena or the experiences that you see have to do with your living, and have to do with your living because of this. Because at any moment you are how you are in a particular domain which has to do with how you have lived. So you see what you see in the structure that you have, in the circumstances in which you are with that structure in that moment, which is your present of a history of structural drift. The one that allows me to complete this story with the four relations.
Could you illustrate that?
We shall go on. So, in the second, here I said God with a brush, or wavelengths of light with different lengths that get dispersed differentially. So I deduce different things. In one case, I deduce if I take the brush away from God, then he will not be able to paint. Or if I modify the number of particles or the size of the particles in the atmosphere, the dispersion will be different. So I try to do that. I spent a lifetime watching God very early to see so I may steal the brush and I don't do it. I cannot complete this, so that remains as a suggestion, but I cannot make a scientific explanation. But I can modify the concentration of particles or observe situations in which there are bigger particles and change the dispersion, and this whole thing is completed, and then that proposition becomes a scientific explanation. How long does a scientific explanation last? As long as these four conditions are satisfied. If in one moment of your life you deduce certain experiences that you cannot have, not because if you cannot have them, as I could not really find the moment in which God was painting, that puts a question mark on the whole thing. But if it turns out that they are not fulfilled, then the explanation goes down. It's not valid anymore, because stop the four things being satisfied. So scientific explanations are contingent to the satisfaction of the criterion of validation of scientific explanations. These other 2 points are the engineering of doing science. Because if you have done these 2 first, then the other goes practically by themselves in terms of certain things to do.
So the scientific explanation does not admit to metaphor?
No, but you can use metaphors as part of your domain of reflection from which you will bring forth questions or generative mechanisms. You and then you, please.
I wonder if you're not putting number 2 a little too strongly, in the sense that it suggests that you have to have a hypothesis, whereas in many areas of research, a good researcher is better off perhaps to going in with an apparently open mind, knowing they've got a structured experience, but then a hypothesis allowed to emerge.
Oh, these people would call frequently hypothesis, by the way. Because you are proposing something. You are saying, if this and this and this happens, this, of course, has to happen because you propose this ad hoc. This is a generative mechanism that you propose ad hoc, especially so that this happens. It's these other things that are open to further doing, to further experience. Now, the open-mindedness has to do with not cheating in the application of these other 2 further operations, and in being willing to accept that they are not satisfied when they are not satisfied, and not cheating. The temptation for cheating, of course, is always there. Yeah, because you like your propositions.
Couldn't you be open-minded at a stage before that and say, here is a puzzling area? I'm going to go in there with my eyes
poetry.
Before I propose a hypothesis?
In poetry, in this part. Here is where your open-mindedness is also there. Because if your open-mindedness would mean I do not eliminate any domain of questions a priori. For example, suppose that I am a scientist and somebody comes and tells me, I want to study psychism in the universe. And I said, you are stupid. I mean, what do you want to study psychism in the universe? This is a nonsensical question. Well, in fact, a young man came to my laboratory in 1965, was Francisco Varela, who was my student. And after we talked, I said, well, what is your fundamental question? And he said, I want to study psychism in the universe. And I said, fantastic. This is exactly the proper place. But you have to begin studying the frog. No, was not sense of humor. Was a serious acceptance of his question. But to treat that question as a question that you can handle scientifically, you must expand your domain of experiences, such that that question can be handled. And one way of expanding the domain of experiences and experiences in scientific explanation was doing certain things that were more close to daily experience than psychism in the universe. Is the concern about psychism in the universe a legitimate concern? Of course. Any concern is legitimate. Any. If I am a scientist, every question is legitimate. Every question is legitimate, no matter which. There are questions for which I cannot provide scientific explanations? Yes. But it is because I cannot satisfy this condition, not because the question is illegitimate. It's an entirely different thing. I am not open-minded if I think they are illegitimate questions. Sometimes a teacher says to a student, that's a stupid question. Again, this is not legitimate to do. I think that there is no stupid questions. But I can make stupid any question if I don't listen properly. But that is the task of my poetry. If you have a good poet, you can give to this good poet any line and he gets a poem from it. Any word you ask, look, make a poem around the word such and such, you get a poem. About a line very contrived, he gets a poem. Because every assortment of words for a poet is an opportunity for grasping or for expressing the grasping of a particular configuration of experiences in human life. But all this criterion has to do with daily life. This is exactly the criterion that we use in daily life when we explain or handle our explanations of our relations in life. When the mother tells the child, look, when you cross the street, remember that you are in Australia, and so you have to look to the left when you are crossing the street, not to the right as you would do in Chile. Because blah, blah, blah. She is handling the satisfaction of this criterion to be able to say, if you do not do this, such and such may happen. Scientific explanations use a criterion of validation that is proper to daily life. What is peculiar of scientists is that they are careful in satisfying this criterion for generating their explanations, and in daily life we are not. Sometimes we are careful, sometimes we are not. And the scientist is also careful in not confusing domains. In daily life, sometimes we are careful, sometimes we are not. And the scientist is careful in having what you said, an open mind, or whoever said, was you, or somebody, you said it, having an open mind. That means in not prejudging the result beforehand. In daily life, sometimes we are not. So science is a special, refined operation of daily life. Does this degrade science? No, enriches it. But at the same time, allows us scientists not to believe ourselves to be very special beings, because we are not. And it's very important that we believe that we are not special beings, because our ability to be scientists depends on our capacity to being poets. And our capacity to be poets has to do with our daily life.
Because that process has been abstracted from human experience, what is the difference between the criterion of validation for scientific explanation and the criterion of validation of religious experience, for example?
For religious explanations. No, every experience is valid. If I say I was galloping in my horse, going to Damascus to persecute Christians, and suddenly I saw a light, I fell from the horse, and I heard a voice, Paul, Paul, why do you persecute me? And I tell you this, you have no reason to say this is not a valid experience. This happened to me. Excuse me, happened to Paul. Now we may dispute about the explanation, but the experience, they are not valid or invalid experiences. But there are explanations that we accept and explanations or propositions of explanation that we do not accept. But there was something else in your question that I just...
Implying that if you accept the language as the domain of Paul's experience, which is the language of
now I remember, yeah.
Would the same shape of criterion, in fact, fit that other domain?
Not usually. If it were to satisfy, then would be a scientific explanation. But religious explanations are explanations in terms of given truth. If it satisfies a certain set of beliefs or expectation, then is accepted because of that. Let me, yes?
So point 3 says the operational coherences then
yes.
are given truths for the religious experience.
That is a possibility, that they are given truth, or you have a causal notion behind. For example, whenever you see a light and the voice that speaks to you is God. And that is not strange because in the old tradition, experiences of understanding and enlightenment were usually lived as listening voices. So I would say what happened to Paul is that in whatever was happening in his act of persecution of Christians, suddenly he got an understanding of something else. In pondering about the teachings of Jesus so that he could persecute Christians, suddenly he understood what Jesus was telling. And this struck him as a fundamental change that he lived as hearing a voice. Why do you persecute me? This is a legitimate possibility for what happened because some different people experience their understanding in different manners. And in all times, it was frequent to experience understanding in terms of voices. Some people call themselves visionaries because they experience their understanding in visions. When I went to England to study, I left Chile in 1954. And of course, that was the great opportunity for a young man to have his future told. You have an opening, you are going to travel. So I said, oh my goodness, Mother, you know someone who could tell me my future? And she said, yes, I have a friend, lady so-and-so. So I went to visit this lady, and she said, what do you want? That I see the tarot, the cards, or your hand? The lines of your hand. I said, please, my hand. And so she began to tell me something. And suddenly she was looking at my hands and she said, I know now who you are. I have just seen the face of your mother in your hand. And she said, you are son of so-and-so. And she said interesting things, beautiful things, charming things. She said to me that I was given a year of opportunity, that I was going to have difficulties in England. In fact, I had difficulties in England and so on and so forth. But she said, I know now who you are. I have just seen the face of your mother in your hand. And I went away thinking, what happened here? I mean, was she inventing something? Was this part of her way of talking to people so as to impress them? Or was she revealing an experience that she had? Well, now I think that she saw the face of my mother in my hand. But not in terms of a transcendental seeing, but in terms of a recognition and understanding, because I resemble my mother. I mean, whoever looks at me and has seen my mother may recognize that there is a relationship. Maybe this man now is the son of this woman. But how do you express the recognition? Ah, now I recognize you. How do you live that? Well, some people live this as a vision. I think that this woman lived the recognition of a relationship between me and my mother because we resemble as a vision. And these people are usually called visionary because these people get understanding and express them in visions. There is nothing extraordinary mysterious in that. It's unusual. We are not accustomed to this. And if we do not have the experience of having an experience of recognition or understanding in terms of a vision, we don't do it. My experience of understanding are of a different kind. I never have visions. But suddenly I understand configurations. Suddenly, boom, a pattern is in my understanding present. This varies with the people. So the experience is not the problem. We never honestly fight for experiences unless we claim that the other is lying. Our disputes have to do with explaining.
If you have an explanation in one culture of an event, an experience, and somebody from another culture, completely different culture, experiences the same experience but uses a different explanation. Can you call one scientific and another not scientific? It's maybe related to the previous question.
It depends on whether you are satisfying this or not. Now you are asking me, could two different contradictory propositions be scientific explanations of the same phenomena or the same experience? This is what you are asking me. Let us take a case. Let us take the movement of the planets and eclipses. And I propose this case because it's a well-known case. And you had Ptolemaic theory and Copernican theory. The Ptolemaic explanation in the Greek tradition was there was this sky with these planets moving around the Earth, the sun moving around the Earth, and each one of these celestial bodies moving in a circular path around the Earth, but with additional movements which were cycles on the big cycles, were epicycles. And this was accepted, this allowed to compute eclipses and so on and so forth. And then Copernicus says, no, the Earth is not the center of the solar system or of the world, but it's the sun. The Earth moves around the sun, and the moon moves around the Earth. And with this, you can also compute eclipses. And if you look at the computation of eclipses, both allow you for computation of eclipses. Now, which is valid? You must look in here. Which other experiences must take place from the operational coherences entailing the proposition that the Earth is the center, or which arise from the proposition that the sun is the center? Well, one is that you could compute eclipses. You do? Both allow you to compute eclipses, but they propose different things. If you only consider one and the computing of eclipses is a scientific explanation, was Ptolemaic proposition a scientific explanation under the deduction of eclipses? Yes, it was. But if you look for other things, then it was not. Other thing would have to be, for example, then if I am standing on Venus, what I shall see is completely different from what I see when I'm standing on the Earth, because Venus will be revolving around the Earth. Can I do some deductions of certain astronomical observation that will tell me how I see the world from Venus? Then I go and find out that if that doesn't happen, that means that is not the case. Now, in the Ptolemaic, in the Copernican, say, if I'm standing on Venus, I will be seeing fundamentally the same thing as I see from the Earth, because Venus is moving around the sun as the Earth is moving around the sun. Are there astronomical observations that I can make that can tell me this or that, and go and make it, and I do that in my experience, then the Copernican is validated as a scientific explanation.
There's a certain sort of compelling element to it, but it gets rather more fuzzy when it gets into issues of, for example, culture and explaining the nature of culture, or, as Judy so rightly said, of mystical experience.
Well, no, I don't think so. What happens is that the phenomena that we want to explain and the domains, generative mechanisms that we want to propose are of a different kind. If, for example, I do not understand this, then I say, well, how are you going to explain materially a phenomenon that doesn't have a material grounding, like an experience, a mystical experience? There you are, and suddenly you have this expansion of awareness. You find yourself part of this cosmic relation system. How are you going to explain this materially? This sounds preposterous. Because I believe, or the person that does that believes that materiality and that which is explained must be of the same kind. But if there are different phenomenal domains, I have no problem. I have to only provide a physiology such that if certain things happen, your experience is one of expansion. I may not be able to do so because I do not know enough physiology, but this is what I would have to provide. So in principle, there is no problem.
Then are we stuck with the problem of there is no unconscious and there is no superconscious for the same reason?
We will have to find out what we're talking about when we speak about consciousness or superconsciousness. For example, in the case of Freud, the unconscious and the superconscious, the superego, what are these? Are these entities or are these operations? If they are entities, then certain consequences should follow. If they are operations, then other consequences have to follow. So I have to be clear on what I'm talking about. Now, if I'm not clear about that, then it's fuzzy. But when I hear in a psychoanalytic thinking, when I listen about the unconscious and the superego, what are they talking about? What are the phenomena or the experiences that they are referring to? If these become clear through the distinctions that one makes, or the operations of distinction under which one distinguishes superego or unconscious, then there is no problem. What happens though is, if I am in objectivity without parentheses, I say, well, but the superego is there independent of me. And then, of course, I have a difficulty because the superego must tell me what it is. And this I cannot reach. But from this other question is, what operation do I perform to claim that superego operation is taking place? And then the situation is completely different and does not become fuzzy. Unless I do not see what operation I do. And that means I have to reflect a little bit more about what do I do to claim that, you see, your superego is working now. Yes? Who was you?
I'm just wondering with the question or the proposition that to be an explanation it has to be accepted. In science, the ultimate acceptance is a community acceptance. Perhaps we were saying yesterday it's a consensus acceptance in which there are social factors.
Yeah. The scientific community is the community of those persons that use this as the criterion of validation of their explanations. And the whole training of a scientist is a training to become a member of the community of scientists. It's a training in membership in a club. Which club? The club of those persons that like to explain using this criterion as the criterion of validation of their explanations.
But we will accept as well that they may be prejudiced, they may be locked, fixed.
Of course. We scientists are full of prejudices, of passions. We claim that we know we have no prejudices and we have no passions, but we are full of passions and prejudices, certainly.
So acceptance takes account of those, it allows those factors.
Yeah, but the only thing that we scientists are careful is this is the criterion of validation of our explanation. If I find you, my dear student, that trapped in your passions and prejudices violate this, you are expelled. But if you have passions and prejudices without violating this in your explaining, this is okay. I don't mind. I treat you as if you did not have passions and prejudices. And this is a standard observer. In science, the standard observer is the observer that has this as the criterion of validation of his or her explanations. What standardizes this scientist as an observer is the criterion of validation of scientific explanations. In a religious community, again, you have a standard observer defined by the criterion of validation of this legitimate statement in the religious community. And when some member of a community, of a religious community, stops using the criterion of validation of the community, he or she is expelled. Heretic! Expelled. So science is, the scientific community is a club. An interesting club because it has to do with daily life in a very special manner, but it's a club.
The emotion gets aroused in them when you get into the distinctions between objectivity and pragmatism.
Yeah, but science does not make the distinction. Because, you see, the distinction has to do with human relations. Science, you can't be a scientist here or here. Science does not make the distinction. This is the only criterion for scientific explanation. A scientific statement is valid because it's founded on a scientific explanation. A Christian statement is valid because it's founded on a certain body of beliefs. A Marxist statement is valid because it's founded on certain configuration of notions and beliefs that constitute the doctrine of Marxism. Your behavior is valid in this club because it complies with the criterion of belongingness to the club. That means the behavior that is admitted as legitimate behavior as for the members of the club. It's the same thing.
You wouldn't want a thesis judged by a member of the wrong club, would you?
Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. You see, because whatever I do as a scientist, judged from a particular religion, is illusion. And whatever this person in this particular religion does, judged from the perspective of science, is an illusion. Illusions are behaviors valid in one domain, observed from another domain. In objectivity, without parentheses, illusions are intrinsical mistakes. It's a different thing. Here, an illusion is something intrinsically wrong, not dealing with reality. Very well. So, but this whole discussion about science has to do in part with science being an important part of our culture. And I'm not speaking about science, against science. I'm a scientist. And imagine that I shall die a scientist. I don't think that I shall change. Who knows? No, I cannot know the future. But here I'm speaking to you as a scientist. So whatever I say is not to say, look, science doesn't work, it's nonsensical. No, it's perfectly sensical. But this is what we scientists do. And this is the strength, if you wish, of science, because it has to do with daily life, with experience. Not with suppositions about valid explanations of a different manner. See, you explain experience with experience. You explain experience with coherences of experience. Newton, the great physicist, picks up the apple and lets it fall. It's fantastic. If I release the apple, it falls. Whenever I do, it happens. And by observing the regularities of this game with the apple, I'm sure it was not with the apple, but it doesn't matter. I mean, he invents the notion of gravity. And he invents a description of the regularities of the falling bodies with regularities of experience. But he uses regularities of experience to explain regularities of experience. He explains the movement of the planets by using regularities of experience with bodies. What does he see in the movement of the planet? Well, what he sees, I mean, he sees the planets moving in a certain way. He doesn't see moving this way, he goes this way and that in relation to the sun and so on and so forth. And through these regularities he supposes, or was not he, was Copernicus, and then some other astronomers said that it's moving in elliptic sense and so on and so forth. And then he says, if these are the regularities, then with these regularities I can explain, that means I can make a generative mechanism, which if it were to apply, would result in that the planets would move in an elliptical path. And not only that, but objects in general would move with respect to each other in a particular manner, which has to do with this notion of gravity, which expresses what? Like a poet, a configuration of regularities of experiences. So he explains experience with experience. And this is what makes the possibility of doing with science what you do. You handle experience. But in other cases, we have not experience, but an interpretation of experience as a starting point. You have certain experience. You have an experience of expansion. You say, I met God. And you use this experience as an argument for validating an interpretation of the experience. And then you begin to construct something with it. And that has a different character than this one. Now, it may be that one meets God, but then anyhow it's a different character, because the criterion is not this, but the acceptance that what experience, that the valid interpretation of the experience is meeting God. So you get different things. This is why you do different things with religion than with science, because you bring forth different domains of realities as domains of coherences of experiences. These different realities are different domains of coherences of experiences. But if we understand the story about science, we have understood something which is very important: the multiplicity of phenomenal domains, the generative relation in the explanations, the fact that there are phenomena that entail different systems but do not take place in the systems. Behavior entails the organism and the medium, but does not take place in the organism, nor in the medium, but in the relation. And what I shall tell you about language, for example, among other things, is that language does not take place in the brain, but takes place in the dynamics of relations of the organism. And that is an important starting point for understanding, not important in itself, for understanding other phenomena, like human relations. We say, I have in my mind, and we point to our head, I have in my mind. But what if I tell you, it's interesting that we say, I have in my mind, but the mind doesn't take place in the brain, but takes place in the relation. Interesting, isn't it? It changes the whole thing. But after this discussion, maybe it is not so crazy to say that the mind takes place in the domain of relations. But for that, we have to accept the legitimacy of these non-intersecting domains, and the legitimacy that explanations, and scientific explanations in particular, because they are very important in our culture, do not consist in reducing one phenomenal domain into another. You do not express one phenomenal domain in another. No, you establish a generative relation. I propose to stop here for lunch.
maybe a few minutes preparing lunch. If we came back at, say, 2:15, could we come back about 2:15? It'll give us 15 minutes or so to talk about some things, and then Humberto can take over. Also, I forgot to mention, I've put a couple of printouts just above where the bibliographies are outside. They're taped on the wall, and they list by profession, in alphabetical order by profession, people who are at the weekends, either at the first weekend, at both weekends, or the second. So if you want to see the range of people who are here, and if you want to see like-minded people, in a sense, we're all like-minded, then you can just have a look at that and go and make your introduction in whatever way. So let's say 2:15.
Very good.